What you see behind me is the world's largest animal. It is truly majestic. It's the blue whale. And yet, if you consider the size of the swimming pool it is in, our great oceans, it is tiny. It's like less than a needle in a haystack, right? Why is that so? Why is that so? Why are even the largest animals growing to a few dozen feet, but not a mile? And then, once you go down this path of slightly awkward questions, you come across this one. Why do companies, in fact, why do they stop growing at $500 billion in assets? And why do cities that rapidly expand become more dangerous too? Question marks. And all three questions are actually part of a bigger puzzle of life. And that puzzle is, why do things scale in the first place and then most of the time at some point go stale and then, unfortunately, rapidly collapse and fail? I joined the World Economic Forum just a couple of days before one of the greatest whales in the financial services industry, Lehman Brothers, some of you might remember, collapsed and plunged the world economy into crisis. And absorbing the palpable fear of the CEOs and heads of state gathering at our annual meeting only a couple of weeks later made me aware of one thing. And that is that scale, being big, being at the helm of a big organization. Bankers were called at the time masters of the universe. All of that can give us superpowers, but it can also make us very frail. And if there's one thing that I took away from convening these people for almost a decade, it is that if we want to avoid breaking big, we have to tackle two fundamental limitations to scale. And I will call them the plankton problem and the Godzilla problem. Okay, but let's first start with a very simple observation, and that is that all organisms, without exception, are burning energy. And they're burning energy for two basic tasks, and that is growing and then fixing itself, maintenance. As humans, we are actually, at least as biological beings, quite efficient. We burn the energy of a single light bulb every day. It's not bad. What happens, though, is that regardless, over time things break. That means that maintenance consumes more and more and more energy. And the moment that maintenance function cannot keep up anymore, the organism dies. It's nothing like starting a talk with a cheerful story. But when it comes to mammals, our family here, there's another stunning, and I would say slightly spooky commonality. And that is that all mammals die, on average, after 1.5 billion heartbeats. But then, of course, life expectancies are very different. Very different. And there's one explanation for that. And that explanation is scale. The heart of the biggest mammal on Earth beats just 10 times per minute. The clock of the smallest animals ticks much, much, much faster, up to 1,500 times. So, here you have actually a pretty good answer to the first part of my question. Why do things scale? We live longer. It's powerful. It's actually quite a powerful argument for growing big if you think about it. But then, why don't we live in a world of whales? Why are they still mice? The typical answer that one would get for this kind of question is resources. Oh, if I would just have a few more resources, it would all be great. And indeed, if you look at the story of the whale, it is consuming 1 million calories worth of plankton and krill every day. That's more or less what we consume in an entire year. So clearly, the availability of this stuff in the sea must play a role. And then if you go a little bit deeper into the history of whales, you realize that they're around for a really, really, really long time, 35 million years. But the big blue one only came about quite recently. And that was a time when warmer climates brought out more nutrients in the sea. So, all to say, resources are, of course, a threshold to growth. Every organism, to benefit from scale, needs to overcome its plankton problem. Now, that's a pretty straightforward story. And maybe that's why we have heard it so often, and that's why we have told it so often. But I would also say it is just half the truth. Thought experiment. What if you would feed 1 million calories of cheese to a mouse? That is the less likely outcome, I would say. A whale-sized mega mouse. Or the more likely outcome is this one. Right? A mouse with high cholesterol and heart problems. That is, on that image, that is the story of rich nations in one slide, more or less. So there is a reason, there's a pretty good reason why scaled-up creatures like Godzilla only exist in fiction. And that reason is physics. And now Godzilla fans have to be very strong. If you scale a lizard to the size of Godzilla, it will simply, sadly, collapse under its own weight. Its bones would break, its muscles would tear, and so on. And the reason is that strength increases with size, but at a lower rate. Simple as that. Well, think about it this way. An ant could lift 5 times its brothers and sisters if it wanted to. An elephant? Forget it. Couldn't lift a single elephant. Useless. And Godzilla, well, couldn't even lift itself. So that is the Godzilla problem. That is the problem. That is why scale can give us superpowers, but it can also make us incredibly frail. So that is the biological world, or the physical world, if you like. Now, what about the social creatures we are building, like companies and cities and entire countries? They behave much the same way. The most astonishing example is cities. Salaries, patterns, even walking speeds increase at a stable rate with the population size of a city. If you move tomorrow to a city twice as big as your hometown, you're going to make about 15% more. And you're going to walk 10% faster. It's good for your health as well. It's quite compelling, no? And then when it comes to companies, there's a similar play. When you compare assets and profits. In the US, about half of all profits are going to 30 mega corporations in terms of assets. Sort of the equivalent of mega cities. If you move as an employee into one of these corporations, no matter if you go there as a janitor or as a top manager, by the way, your salary is going to beat that of your peers. So it's not too surprising that more and more people are moving into cities. And it's not too surprising either that companies grow and markets become more concentrated and that industries become more concentrated and so on. But then, what is putting in the stops? Why don't these social creatures grow endlessly either? That's a good question. Well, a good starting point is indeed the plankton problem. I can tell you it's impossible to talk to a CEO who is not worried about access to talent. It might be a bit different here in Boston and Cambridge, but at least that's where I'm from. If you look at the level of cities, there are examples like Cape Town, a flourishing city, has exploded in terms of population size over the past decades. And then it has been hit by a drought just a couple of years ago, and it's going on. It might be the first city in the modern age running entirely out of water. It would be a disaster. And it could even happen this year. So that is an example of the plankton problem. If you look at the example of entire societies, the relentless race for resources and trade routes. People are talking a lot about trade wars at the moment. Well, it's an expression of the plankton problem, and so is migration, which is the desperate race of people towards countries that hold the promise of a better life. So the plankton problem is here, and it is certainly severe. And yet, I would argue, it fails to grasp some of the most troubling challenges of society today. Why is that? Well, because particularly rich and fast-growing societies, like the United States, or China for that matter, don't fracture because of a lack of resources. They're pretty good, actually, at using resources more efficiently and so on. They risk collapsing under their own weight. And that is a very different story. That is the story of the Godzilla problem. Take the city of New York. It has contributed 10% to the wealth of this country over the past 50 years. It's impressive. It's just one city. Just one city. 2/3 of this, 2/3, got absorbed right away by urban inefficiency. That's sad. Well, if you look at the level of entire societies, there's another problem. There you have a growing number of people living under precarious circumstances, despite all the wealth being created around them. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means family instability, job insecurity, neighborhood distress. Scaling societies put a lot of weight on the bones and on the muscles that are holding them together. That's an expression of the Godzilla problem. Look at corporations. Facebook, the social infrastructure of the world. That vision took quite a heavy hit, not because of some competitors rocking up and eating Facebook's lunch. That not really. Because of weaknesses in its own infrastructure, because of weaknesses inside. And all these challenges at some point build up on the political stage. They build up in the form of anger and resentment against the heads of these social creatures. But I would say more worryingly so, it shows in the form of us, civil society, citizen, fracturing into ever smaller units. If you like, a voluntary, digitally enabled descaling of the citizen body, which makes us collectively weaker and individually much easier to fool. So the point is that modern society doesn't really fracture and suffer from some sort of resource limitation, but really through its own hand. In the beginning, I mentioned that biological organisms carefully divide up their energy between growth and maintenance. Well, what happens with the social creatures we are creating? They're all in for growth. And they hope then for maintenance to take care of itself. And we do that for a very legitimate reason. And that reason is that we want to build giants, right? We want to build giants. We want to live longer. But we end up with this, and eventually with that. Godzilla on shaky legs. So, the Godzilla problem is really posing a rather inconvenient challenge to those who position growth over everything else. Who say, don't worry about inequality, as long as poverty levels don't go up. I'm not so sure. But it also challenges those who are attacking our addiction to growth based on the idea that we are running out of stuff, food and energy and oil. That's not going to happen too soon either. We're actually getting pretty good at becoming more efficient. For me, the most important in looking at the world like this is that it holds a promise. And that promise is that we don't have to choose between breaking big or hitting the brakes, between reckless growth and headless isolation and stagnation. And it does that with a very simple but meaningful formula. We have to cherish and reward more the individuals and the institutions and the ideas that are dedicated to the work of maintenance. What does that mean? It means that societies which invest into their smallest units, families, communities, won't grow faster, but they will be less prone to breaking big. It means that corporations which nurture diversity inside and outside, it's something that Starbucks had to learn the hard way recently, that those corporations won't grow faster, but they will be less prone to breaking big. And it means that if all of us here, once in a while, invest into a good night of sleep, and you hear me speak here as the father of a 1-year-old, our careers will probably not grow faster and our endeavors are not going to be more successful, but we will be less prone to breaking big. And indeed, if you want to fully appreciate what the work of maintenance can do, you don't have to look much further than back at yourself. I'm sure that some of you here in the room, I certainly did, shudder at that statistic here. It's kind of scary. Don't take out your iPhone and calculate where you stand. Fact is that we already live much, much longer than what nature has foreseen. Thanks to maintenance innovations like vaccines, but also very simple ones like soap, we have gained 1 billion heartbeats, 1 billion, over all other mammals on this planet. So let's use them wisely. Maybe decide on one thing we want to start fixing today. Thank you very much.